The colonial history, the legacy of enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism and racial inequality in the US remains a serious challenge as there has been no real commitment to reparation and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent. Despite substantial changes, since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, ideology ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. The dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion among the US population. Lynching was a form of racial terrorism that has contributed to a legacy of racial inequality that the US must address. Thousands of people of African descent were killed in violent public acts of racial control and domination, and the perpetrators were never held accountable. Contemporary police killings and the trauma it creates are reminiscent of the racial terror lynching of the past. Impunity for state violence has resulted in the current human rights crisis and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Racial bias and disparities in the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, and the thought on crimes policy has disproportionately impacted African Americans. Mandatory minimum sentencing, disproportionate punishment of African Americans, including the death penalty, are of grave concern. The persistent gap in almost all the human development indicators, such as life expectancy, income and wealth, level of education, and even food security among African Americans and the rest of the US population reflects the level of structural discrimination that create de facto barrier for people of African descent to fully exercise their human rights. There is a profound need to acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity, and among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and that Africans and people of African descent were victims of this act, continue to be victims of their consequences. Past injustice and crimes against African Americans need to be addressed with reparatory justice. The working group urges Congress to expedite the passing of all pending criminal justice reform bills, including the End Racial Profiling Act, the Second Chance Reauthorization Act, and welcomes the bipartisan support for the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act, with, among other things, proposed to drastically reduce the use of mandatory minimum sentencing. The working group recommends to the government to allow independent monitoring of places of detention in the United States.